This is Project Management Paradise. This episode of the Project Management Paradise podcast is part of a unique limited series called Unlocking Project Success with Professor John McGrath.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Project Management Paradise podcast, your passport to project success. I'm John McGrath, your host, and our guest for this episode is Carl Burney from the Arcadis DPS Group. Carl is the Software Services Delivery Group Operations Director, and he's been with the company over 10 years. I've known Carl for many of these years, and he's worked in large-scale, multi-year complex projects. But I'm sure you can explain this much better than I can, Carl. So could you kick off by telling us a little bit about your project management journey so far?
Okay. Hi, John. Hi, everyone. So I guess my project management journey, unknowns to me, started in the mid-90s. I worked for a company called Sanmina, who are now Sanmina SCI, and I was the NPI, New Product Introduction Engineer. So I was involved in basically building or project managing pilot builds for Sanmina. So I was only in my early 20s then. I worked for that company for about 2 years, and looking back on my career, it was very much the most enjoyable 2 years of, I would say, the first 10 years of my career. And I really realized, about 12 or 13 years ago, that project management was the area that I really, really wanted to focus on. So ultimately from then I kind of moved into more formal project management roles with Arcadis DPS. So it was certainly the experiences of, I guess, 25 years ago that sowed the seed for me of in terms of what I really wanted to do with my career. Okay,
so one factor that it always brings to my mind when we discuss project management is the size and scale of the projects you're working on. So where many of us work in projects, hundreds of thousands or millions, but you are working in projects that are costing billions, multi-year projects. Could you tell us a little bit about that in terms of perhaps how it's different, how it's more stressful, how it's more enjoyable, or how large complex projects differ from more traditional projects?
It's a good question. And I think like the traditional project management phases, in any project, be it small or large, they're essentially quite simple. So you have your initiation, you get into your execution and delivery, and ultimately at the end you have kind of project closeout. And I've earlier on in my career, as I mentioned in Sanmina, I worked on projects then that were really 1 to 2 weeks, some of them, and up to maybe a couple of months. But certainly in Arcadis DPS, since I started over 11 years ago, all the projects I've been on have been, as you say, large cap complex projects that are in the billions, and the typical durations will be anything from really 2 to 5 years. So for example, I've worked on projects that are 5 years in and they're still going. So the phases are certainly the same, but the challenges are very different. And I think project fatigue, which is one of the themes that we're going to talk about today, I've kind of carried that in my head for, I would say, most of my time with Arcadis DPS, if truth be known, because I realized in terms of the projects that I was on, that they're very, very tiring, they're very draining. And I think for anybody that works in project management, I think most people would say it's tough, and at times it's very, very tough. And managing your energy levels and indeed, managing and respecting the energy levels of the team you work with and a lot of people around you is really, really important. And I think for me, for my sins in some ways, but certainly what I would regard as my biggest strength is my passion. But as we know, most of our strengths are, our weaknesses as well. So you're kind of walking a fine line in that regard. So I found in my first kind of 3 or 4 years, or even my first 2 or 3 years in Arcadis DPS, that the projects that I were on, while we were successful delivering them, they were incredibly draining. And that was despite, a lot of support from our client and indeed our colleagues in Arcadis DPS. But, within a project team, you have challenges on a day-to-day basis. And I think project management has evolved a lot over the last kind of 10, 20 years. And project managers, they're expected to be so much more than they were, back in the day. And, ultimately, we're working in a space where no matter what you're doing in project management or indeed any sector around the world, you're dealing with people, So ultimately, understanding, supporting, caring about your people is really, really important. And I guess to bring it back to, the challenges on these large cap long projects, it is managing the energy levels. And certainly I felt, and I've lived it, for me, I've certainly lived it, that there was times, that my energy levels were really, really dipping. And then it feeds into your personal life, and then the work-life balance element comes in and things get out of sync. And, it's very, very tough. So, being very tight with the team you're working with and really making difficult work as easy as you can, I think is really the trick, because this is a long game, and a company like Arcadis DPS, we're working on projects for years and years. And if you can't manage your energy levels and ultimately, work with your team to kind of maintain as high an optimal level as you can for an extended period of time, if you can't do that, burnout is a real risk, I would say, which ultimately can affect, delivery to the client and obviously delivery to the company that you work for as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. That there's a hell of a lot in that, and I certainly hope we'll get through this in more detail during the podcast. But one thing that struck me as you were speaking, your role is the operations director of the software services group. But when you described the project, you described it in traditional PMI, PMBOK, initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, and control. So I was sitting listening to that and thinking, that's very unusual for software development to describe it in a more traditional versus an agile. But then I thought of the level and the scale of the projects you're working on, multi-year, multi-billion. And I suppose what I'm actually trying to figure out here, when you're working on something that big, is it more difficult to have an agile or more iterative approach in terms of project execution?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. And I suppose, like in the first 5 years of my career with Arcadis DPS, I was, working as a project manager on the front line on these kind of large cap projects. So I managed the functional area. For anyone that's aware of the semi-conductor industry, obviously there's 13 or 14 different key processes within the manufacturing of wafers. And I was a senior PM in the wet etch area. And, we had our own team within, a bigger group of teams. And ultimately we were all feeding into, helping the client and indeed the trades deliver these projects. So there's thousands of people involved in this. And I think, there's a couple of things that come to mind, certainly in that first. So really, in a way, my career with Arcadis DPS has been in two phases. The first phase, which was probably in the order of 5 years, was project management on the front line. And then the last kind of 6 years, I've been in the software services group. And I it's been very different, but I've really enjoyed it. So we're at a point now where we're working on, a bunch of these projects around the world for our clients. So they're all large cap, they're all complex, they all go on for years and years. And we're kind of juggling that, in terms of the system, the system and the solution that we continue to deliver for the client. And, in terms of like even when I look back, when you're on projects that are, lasting 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you have to allow for attrition, for example. So I mentioned, my experiences in San Mina in the mid-90s. I mean, I was essentially back then, I was the senior project manager, but some of these projects were literally going on for a couple of weeks. They were intensive, but they were short. Whereas, in our company, working with our client, they're going on for years. So you have to allow for attrition. You have to allow for, promotions and stuff like that, which is part of succession planning. And even one thing that kind of resonated with me early on, you can have kind of SMEs, subject matter experts at project management level, for example, in certain areas of the project. But, there's kind of that relay effect as well. I mean, you could argue that an ideal state would be having the exact same team on the project from the very beginning right through to the end. But in reality, that doesn't happen for a bunch of reasons. So, there's elements of kind of bring in certain people at a certain time to deliver that level of expertise. They move on then to something else. And all the while you're developing your people. And then if I go back to what I'm doing now in the software services space, and I suppose I should probably put a caveat on this. Like I'm an operations guy. I'm a manufacturing engineer by trade. I'm not an IT person. I'm not like, I clearly know enough about what we do to be dangerous in terms of, meeting the client, interacting very closely with the leadership team in my group. But I leave the software delivery to the folks in my team that are very, very good at it. So it's having an appreciation, a very good appreciation for what we do. And I guess in my role, because I've come up through the ranks in Arcadis DPS, I've a very good kind of sectorial knowledge of what we do, and I understand the client's business very well, and I understand the solutions that we deliver to the client. I understand what they do and why they're important and how they help eliminate kind of pain points and stuff. So does that make sense?
It certainly does make sense, but it's very interesting when you speak about, and I suppose you put your hands up and give full disclosure, I'm not a software person.
Definitely not.
I really think that's the essence of successful project management, in that we're looking at diversity in our project team. So your operation sort of looking at things in a very organized, structured, business as usual fashion, I think that's bringing a very important dynamic to the team. I think we've looked at things like Belbin Teams model before ourselves. There are a whole range of things I think that can help you investigate that all people in different project teams are wired differently and they have different skill sets. And it's the collective effort that really delivers project success as opposed to any individual. As I'm listening to you, Carl, I'm thinking in terms of our listeners or our viewers who are with us today. And I think that it would be reasonable to say, even from the audio alone, people can pick up that you're a very intense, a very passionate person in terms of what you do. So maybe a scary person, but I don't think that would be fair just yet to say that. But certainly this is not our first rodeo. We have discussed and we've worked together on different projects before. I've known you for essentially for a very long time. And I have to say, I've known you as a straight shooter. You're very firm but fair. You're the first person to call out underperformance or a lack of commitment to a project, but you're also the first person to stand up for people who need a bit of help. And I would describe you as that your loyalty is always to the project and to the project team, not to any individual person. I think that's a really good trait in a project management. But I wonder then, in terms of what you're trying to do, I think and it comes back to your earlier points, this is about creating a team dynamic. And we all know that people deliver projects, not processes deliver projects. So I just wonder, how do you create that team dynamic in terms of the large complex projects you're currently working in?
It's something that I often think about. And I mean, there is no exact recipe. I don't think. I think we all have our different styles, and I think most of us are trying to do the right thing and the best thing we can by our teams, our clients, and the company that we work for. But ultimately, I do agree with you, John. Like we're all in the people business, whether, I look at what I'm doing now and the team that I'm kind of presiding over, it's still project management. We're still delivering. We still need to deliver value, again, to our clients and indeed to ourselves and the company we work for. But investing in people, I think, is absolutely essential. And I suppose I've always believed that a rising tide lifts all ships. So if you and others around you, are very invested in each other, the process and what you're doing, ultimately you're gonna help. You're all going to help each other to be the very best you can be. And I think, I'm going to say was, because I think it is in the past, there was a kind of an old school train of thought that knowledge is power. And, right at the beginning of my career, I did work with some people who, didn't kill themselves, kind of transferring knowledge to myself, who was very junior, and others around them. And I just, even back then, at 20, 21 years of age, I just didn't accept that was the way things needed to be done. Now, clearly, you develop in confidence and you grow as a person, personally and professionally over the years. And, that never sat well with me. And I think really knowledge is empowering. And what I've found over my entire career, I get the most joy and always have out of helping people. And I think ultimately, if we all help each other, we're helping the greater good. And I think the team, not least the team dynamics. So, you have different personalities in a team, and so you should. I've often said one of me in any group I'm in is plenty. And, people that have worked with me would probably say that too. So we don't need a bunch of nodding ponies. We need people that are challenging each other. And I think, positive conflict, and I say the word positive because, not fighting, but more, professionally challenging each other on what we're doing is very, very necessary. And, I'm one of these people, for my sins, I do actually enjoy conflict in the workplace because it evokes passion, and I think ultimately it helps us, improve as people. And really the most important thing I'd say within a team is that there's a shared kind of growth mindset. So once we're all kind of ultimately pushing the rock or the boulder up the hill, we can have different views and different opinions and different ideas and different backgrounds. All of that is important. But I think if we share that common kind of, I don't know whether you call it personal or personality attribute or just a way of thinking, that if you're constantly thinking of the greater good, and that, you hear some people say the North Star, there's phrases like that, but ultimately if you and those around you are driving, to be the best you can be, I think you're never going to go far wrong in a team. And I do often say to the team that I work with that we should aim for perfection at all times. And if all we achieve is, excellence or very good, how bad are we?
That's a really good line. We'll aim for perfection, but settle for excellence. So I think that's your operations background coming in, I think. I don't know how we're going to fit all this into about 20 minutes, but you've mentioned some really kind of things that have connected with me, and I think will connect with our listeners. So in terms of, you mentioned your early career, maybe at age 21, leaving higher education, and you mentioned the idea that you met project managers who perhaps weren't very good at sharing or mentoring. And I'm sure you've met amazing project managers as well. And I certainly think that's something in the project management profession. We all can think back to our early days and we can identify somebody, and we almost say, whatever you do in your career, don't be like that person and you'll do a reasonable job. But we all have the North Star project manager, that sort of project leader person we met, who sort of mentored us, cared for us, developed us along the way. And I certainly think it's great to hear you saying that, because I think all project managers have that experience. The idea of connecting the team and also then talking about the people side of it. One of the most fascinating conversations I've had with you over the years is around the area of project fatigue. So you've actually conducted some research. You've had your work published in a number of journals in terms of your wheel of fatigue. And I can see it in the top right corner of your screen, something you're proud of, and so you should be. So essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the essence of looking at project fatigue is something that I think all of us as project managers can relate to. As a project goes on, we feel weary, perhaps the same as a marathon runner. The first 10 miles is okay, the last 5 miles is hell. So in terms of, could you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea, or how you experienced project fatigue, and how that drove you to actually conduct some MBA level research around project fatigue?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And you're right. I take every opportunity I can to kind of plug my little framework that's on the screen there. So it's the project fatigue wheel of mitigation. And if I can do a little shout out to Sarah Madden, who works very closely with me in SSG. Sarah, back when I was doing my MBA in TU Dublin from 2017 to 2019, I to be honest, I went into that MBA knowing that I was going to do my thesis on project fatigue. And I mean, you could certainly argue I had a bias, and I did have a bias, and I was delighted to have a bias because it was an area that I felt really strongly about. And I had all these ideas in my head running around, and the drivers that you can see on the kind of circumference of that framework, we obviously have project manager, succession planning, knowledge harvesting, project closure, occupational stress. So they were kind of 6 pertinent drivers of project fatigue for me. And Sarah, who I mentioned a moment ago, she worked very closely with me and helped take the ideas out of my head and kind of put them in a framework that I think kind of articulates it quite well. And again, I'm naturally biased, but so like really for me, as I mentioned, like I'm not a half in, half out person. I think if I'm doing something, I tend to try and do it all in, which has its challenges because, I mean, obviously we have our work and personal lives, so that you're always trying to balance that. So very early on in my career with Arcadis DPS on these large cap projects, I realized that it was really tough. And while the team I worked with, I was fortunate enough that I got into the project very, very early, and I was able to build my team. I did my own recruitment, and I recognized I guess in a lot of the people I interviewed, I saw something in certain people I interviewed, and maybe I saw a bit of myself. I'm not entirely sure, but some of the people that I recruited early on, some have left Arcadis DPS and some have even come back. And I think what I've noticed over the years, like I build friendships with people that kind of, I suppose drink the Kool-Aid in the way I do in terms of the projects that they're delivering. But certainly, I knew very early on that what we were doing was very, very difficult. And, I'm but one person. My team is but one team as part of a much bigger kind of project. And as I mentioned earlier, there is thousands of people involved in these projects. But, ultimately, because it's so tough, you have to have the right people around you, and definitely the right kind of like-minded, and again, like-minded in the context of maybe a growth mindset and being very team orientated. So I was fortunate enough to be able to, put together a team, that were, essentially, we were all learning together, but we became a fairly high performing team, after, it kind of started from maybe 6 months in.
Okay.
And,
yeah. I'm just thinking here, Carl, and I'm trying to think of it in terms of the listener.
Yeah.
If somebody's out for a walk or driving to work and they're listening to this podcast, I think that when we mention project fatigue, a small light bulb has gone off in a lot of project managers who are listening today. And I actually think that your 6 key drivers are really important. And what you have done, we've all had this itch we wanted to scratch in terms of understanding project fatigue, but you've actually put it together in a structured way. So I'm just going to take a moment to reiterate those 6 key drivers, and then we might just take a quick comment in each of them. So I'll just call it the 6 of them first. So the first you said earlier was the project manager. That was number 1. Number 2, succession planning. Again, mini light bulbs going off here in my own head as I look at this. Number 3, risk management. Number 4, knowledge harvesting. Number 5, occupational stress. And number 6, the closeout of the project. So let's take driver number 1, the project manager. Talk to me a little bit about that, please.
Okay, so the project manager, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a much different role than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So you're kind of, you have to have a lot of kind of strings to your bow, and clearly you have to be, client-centric, delivery-centric. You have to be very mindful of the scope, and you have to be very mindful of the challenges on the project. And you absolutely, I think, have to be very people-centric. So I found, like, what was very kind of obvious to me early on was there was no way I was going to be able to cope with the challenges on that first big project that did go on for almost 4 years. I wouldn't have been able to cope with that if I had a team that weren't kind of, high performing, or at least aspiring to be high performing. So, so even though as a project manager, on some projects you can be handed a team. We were, these large cap projects, a project manager, may not be managing project controls, for example, because, we certainly had a project controls department at the time, because these projects, as I say, were so big and so complex. So ultimately, I would say the most important thing for a project manager is to surround themselves with the strongest people they can. And I think what's interesting as well, when you're working on these large cap projects, you're predominantly based on a client site, and that in itself can bring challenges, because I've worked with people, over the years, that they actually feel more affiliated to the client than they actually do the company they're working for. And I think what's interesting as well, project managers on these big projects, they essentially have 2 bunches of bosses. So they have the client bosses that they're seeing, quite often, multiple times a day, but certainly daily through operations meetings, etc. And then they have senior management within their own company that are back in the head office that have their views on things as well. So you're kind of balancing all that as well. So I think there's a lot going on, and project management, it is frenetic. It's, it's challenging, it's exciting, it's stressful. So there's a lot going on, but ultimately, first and foremost, it's all about the people.
Okay, so that's very interesting. Again, just trying to summarize this for a listener, but we can hear Carl talking about really the evolving role of the project manager. Perhaps you need to be a therapist as well as an accountant, as well as a leader. And I think that idea that a lot of large projects now, project management isn't enough. We need people to be project leaders and to lead those projects. So I think everyone can relate to that. One observation I would make listening to that is, I think organizations and individuals are doing amazing things in developing project management competency at an individual and an organization level. But I actually think the demands from society are accelerating much faster. So while we are improving our project management capability, we are actually still slipping behind slightly. So more and more work is becoming projectized, the gig economy. You look at global events that have happened, supply chains, Brexit, COVID, remote working. These are all projects that are unplanned, large, complex projects that have sort of been thrown onto the project pipeline on top of everything else. So I think everyone can relate to number one. Let's go to number two, succession planning. Tell me a little bit about that driver of project fatigue.
Yeah, succession planning is something that I've always been massively interested in. And I'm actually going to catch myself out at some stage in the next few years, because the mantra I kind of live by with succession planning, certainly from a personal perspective, when I go into a project or into a role, one of my goals is to do myself out of a job, which sounds a bit silly, but ultimately, when I've got to a point where there's somebody, kicking at my heels to do what I do, and I'm not saying I do anything special, but ultimately in the natural succession of things, when I have somebody that's in a position to take over from what I do, I'm absolutely thrilled, because ultimately I know on a personal and professional development level, I've done a couple of things right, and even when I look back on that first project, which was out in Leixlip, a large confidential semiconductor client, I actually left the project in the end of 2015, and I spent really the last year, so most of 2015, working very closely with a key person on the team. I'll say his first name, Ian. I still know Ian very well. But when I left that project, I look back and I think nobody gave a damn that I was leaving. Now, I'd love to think that they missed my dynamic personality and my sense of humor, but from
your good looks, of course, Carl.
Well, absolutely, my good looks, that's a given, John, of course, like yourself. But I think professionally, and in terms of continuity of work, it didn't matter that I left, and I think that was that for me personally, irrespective of what anyone else I've ever worked with, whatever their view is on that time I was there. For me, my personal legacy was that I was able to leave a project after almost 4 years, and nobody really cared that I was gone. So that to me felt like I'd done a pretty good job. And obviously all through that 4 years we were delivering as well. But as you mentioned, John, the whole idea of investing in people, ultimately that's what it's all about, because it doesn't matter what we're doing. And even with new tech coming in, we're all still going to be dealing with humans. And I think it's like studying for an exam. If you don't put in the work until the last week, you're probably not going to do amazingly well in an exam. And it's the same with people. The work you put in, how you invest in people and a team, ultimately what you put in is what you get out. So, I as I said, even still, I mean, I've an excellent colleague, Sarah, who, as I mentioned earlier, designed that framework for me. I mean, ultimately, Sarah, I think at some point down the road will replace me in the role that I'm in. And if and when that happens, that's fantastic, because I'll probably be off doing something else. And maybe at some stage in my career, I'll do it one time too many and there'll be nothing else for me to do. But hopefully I'll have enough to kind of reflect on, and maybe I'll write a book or something, who knows.
Okay, well, that's great to hear you giving some of the credit to Sarah as well. So it takes many people to drive the wheels of project success. So it's great to hear your mitigation wheel was a joint effort. Okay, let's move on. Again, this is a lot of content in this podcast. So I think people who are driving to work, listening to this, or out for their walk, the people driving have gone home. They've gone to bed, perhaps. They need to digest this. And the people walking who are listening, I hope, are sitting down on the park bench at this stage and taking a few notes. So moving on to number 3, which is risk management. At the heart of what we do in project management, we have a plan. The only certainty is the plan isn't going to work out. So between the plan and the actual is the variance. And that variance is essentially risk. So the role of project management is essentially risk management. Talk to me about that driver of project fatigue, please, Carl.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, John. I mean, risk management is like, it's guaranteed you're going to have risks on projects. If there wasn't risks, and some substantial risks, companies like Arcadis DPS wouldn't exist, right? So it's a given there's going to be risks, and how you manage them is very key to project success. And what I found over the years, and when I was doing my research for my thesis, it was quite validated actually with the academic literature review that I did. In a lot of projects, and to be honest, even a lot of projects today, there'll often be a project risk kind of tracker, or an AR tracker, or risk management log, and a lot of the time they're not shared. So they're there, and somebody has put time into reviewing them, and perhaps they're reviewed on a weekly basis, but they're not actually, quite often they're not actually shared with the people that need to see them. And I think one of the things that is very important with risk management, whatever document you use to track it, it should be a living, breathing document, not something that's buried away in a cabinet or in folders. And another thing I'd say, which is quite interesting around risk management, quite often you'll see a lot of risk registers that don't mention roles or people on them. Now, I don't necessarily think you should have a person's name on a risk tracker, but I mean, if you have somebody in your group that's a flight risk for whatever reason, be it, personal, or, they're likely to get another opportunity, or that they're a single point of failure, all of that is essentially a risk, and, as we know in project management, you have to, there's mitigation and there's contingency, and ultimately, even, when you bring processes into it, the less time you're reacting and the more time you're in the strategic space, the better experience that everybody's going to have on these projects. So I think your risk register, it should be a living, breathing document. It should be shared with an appropriate number of people within your team. I wouldn't say you'd send it out to everybody, but you should be tracking these things. And obviously, if there's personnel stuff, for whatever reason associated with it, you need to manage those risks as well. So I think a risk register it's incredibly important, on any project that you'd be working on.
But what's so amazing listening to that, Carl, it's almost fundamental. It almost seems that one of the drivers of project fatigue is we can't make common sense, common practice. It almost seems like the risk register is suffering fatigue. It gets drafted in a spreadsheet once and it gets put away and probably not looked at until there's a major crisis. Whereas you say yourself, every stage gate, every project review, we should really do a reassessment of risk. And I think we tend to certainly do that with schedule and cost, but we don't do it with risk. So I think sometimes if you sort of make minute movements of the dial, almost in terms of your focus, so by moving 2 degrees east, as it may be, you can actually have an amazing impact on the more successful project outcomes. So that's certainly another one. Now, number 4, knowledge harvesting. Now, this is something that we saw PMI bring out in PMBOK. They talked about the role of a project manager in terms of team charter development, developing the people, and also harnessing that knowledge, taking it from the project level and bringing it up into the PMO and using that knowledge. So sort of finding a good practice in one project, bringing it to the PMO, standardizing it, and then rolling it out across all projects. Talk to me about your view on knowledge harvesting as a driver of project fatigue.
Yeah, so knowledge harvesting, it's I mean, to me, it's absolutely essential. And, when we think of, the old term, reinventing the wheel, whatever pain I've went through in my career, at various times, and there has been a lot of joy as well, I might add. But the very challenging stuff, like if I came up against a very significant problem or roadblock, and through collaboration with various people, we built in a little process or whatever to help us overcome that. Like, it seems absurd to me that we don't share that, so, documenting your learnings as you go is, to me, it's incredibly important, because we're all on a journey, professionally and indeed personally, we're on a journey. So, if you don't kind of harvest the knowledge, some of this stuff is going to get left behind. And like, say for myself, for example, like as I mentioned, I'm almost 11 years, well, I'm over 11 years now with Arcadis DPS, and I've learned a lot along the way. I've made a bunch of mistakes, I have, of course I have. I'd like to think I've learned from them all. And the people coming behind you, people that are maybe younger, less experienced, albeit different perspectives, as we've said, is very important. Documenting some of this stuff so that you can help people and ultimately kind of pass the baton on, really, in terms of continuous improvement. So, and what's interesting as well, something that's changed a lot in project management and big projects in particular over the last 10 years, when you're putting a proposal together for a client, they do actually expect that there's a continuous improvement element to the contract you're trying to win. So if you were managing kind of scope X, on a project, and let's say there was, multiple of a kinds of scope X, I mean, it might take you 50 days on X, but when you're on to, X1, X2, X3, your time should be increasing or should be reducing. So you should be getting more efficient at what you do. Okay, so I think in summary, John, from a knowledge harvesting perspective, I think ultimately what knowledge harvesting is it's a means of essentially kind of capturing the continuous improvements on a project, so that ultimately you're passing it on in terms of the knowledge that you've kind of harvested, and it's there for others to use and learn from and contribute to. So it's ever evolving. So I think ultimately, if you have that kind of mantra within a team, you're paying it forward and you're learning from it as well.
Okay, very good. Now, number 5, occupational stress. Now, I think we all know if you can't handle stress, you probably shouldn't be in project management. It's certainly a roller coaster in terms of highs and lows. And we all have days that we don't want to get out of bed, but we got to keep fighting the good fight. But talk to me about that as a driver of project fatigue.
Yeah, again, John, it's a big one, especially on these kind of large cap complex projects. And, you know, we all kind of need to manage our own occupational stress, but I think there's a responsibility on, you know, the company. Well, first and foremost, the team you're working for. So in terms of some of the teams that I've kind of led over the years, I mean, you know, I take occupational stress very seriously. I need to look after myself, and I need to, you know, create an environment where, you know, my team members are doing well as well. And then our company has a responsibility in that space as well. And our client, interestingly enough, do have responsibility as well, because first and foremost, we're all human. It doesn't matter what we're doing. It doesn't matter what money we make. You know, we're all made of the same stuff, as somebody said to me a few years back. So it doesn't matter how you feel you cope with stress. Ultimately, we all have 168 hours in the week, whoever we are on this planet, and how you spend them, you know, and how you feel spending them will have a direct bearing on kind of your personal and professional life. So I'm very, very mindful of, you know, managing our stress as best we can. And just very briefly, even for me, like, you know, when I started with Arcadis DPS in 2012, I had never worked at this level of intensity really before. And certainly by the time I hit 2015, I was burnt out. I would certainly feel I was quite burnt out. And I was fortunate enough at the time, I suppose, one, to recognize it, and two, I was coming to the end of kind of the big work that I was doing. I knew what project I was going on to next. So I was able to actually take some time off it was actually in May of 2015, and I went off on a bit of a hiking trip to Peru and stuff like that. And, you know, so I took time out to just, I suppose you could argue, decompress and just recharge and get ready to go again. And that's what I did. So, and that's, I mean, I'd love to be able to do it every few years. I haven't been, but, you know, whatever it might be for an individual, you know, whatever might work for you in terms of kind of, you know, making your work life as really as easy as possible. And ultimately at the core is the people you work with and how they support and care about you. And if you're having a bad week, that you've somebody there to, you know, pick up the slack, as it were, and help you get through that.
Okay, I think that's very refreshing. As somebody who has, you know, 20 plus years of project management experience, and especially as a man, men tend to be very poor at expressing their feelings. So I think it's really refreshing, you almost to say that part of your duties as a project manager is to look after your mental health. I always think of it that a project is a battle, but a career as a project manager is you've gone to war. So after each battle, you need to recoup, lick your wounds, retrain, and then enter the battlefield again for the next project. So it's very refreshing to hear that. The quote that struck in my mind as you were speaking, I remember hearing somewhere, it's okay not to be okay, and it's absolutely okay to ask for help. And I think project managers can take that from a team, from a personal, from a risk point of view, or even in terms of looking for their project sponsor to step up and give a little bit more help, which is a podcast topic for another day. Finally, absolutely. Number 6, project closure. I might just recap before we move to project closure. So the 6 drivers we've had, 5 of them so far: the project manager, succession planning, risk management, knowledge harvesting, occupational stress, and finally, project closure.
Yeah, project closure is a good one as well, because if, you know, we mentioned the traditional kind of phases of a project right at the start of this podcast. And ultimately, if you don't close a project well, the rest doesn't really matter a damn, because ultimately, you know, closing a project it's absolutely essential. It's essential for the company you work for the team you're part of, and most importantly for the client. And ultimately, quite often you win more work, based on how you've closed out a project, And I think what's interesting, so for example, I mentioned a few minutes ago that when I left the project, there was a good succession plan in place. So again, that kind of feeds into how the drivers that I've kind of picked for my project fatigue wheel and mitigation, they're all intrinsically linked. So any of them in isolation can cause problems, on a project and with how you're coping with the project, and they all can kind of have a detrimental effect on each other. But if we think of project closure, and it's a very interesting one, because what I learned on those first kind of 3 to 4 years on that first big project I was on with Arcadis DPS, the first year and a half was really tough for everybody, because we were all kind of just learning how we work together. And there was a new kind of coordinated construction managed service being kind of implemented by the client. So it took us a while to figure all that out and where our place was and how we all could help each other. But then we got into a beat rate where I don't want to say it was easy, but it definitely got a hell of a lot easier. That we suddenly understood what to do, and it kind of clicked into place. So we'd probably a year that it was, in relative terms, and certainly in retrospect, it was pretty easy. We were all efficient at what we were doing. But what was very interesting then in the last phase of the project, a lot of expertise left the project, because obviously, some of the trade companies and indeed Arcadis DPS, we've to move on and start kicking on new projects. And I did mention that, that I left the project. So you can actually go into a steep learning curve near the end of a project as well. So if you don't manage your succession planning and manage all the key kind of components of the project, it's going to be very problematic at the end. So that kind of ethos of continuous learning, knowledge harvesting, succession planning, risk management, all of that feeds into how you're going to close a project. And the other thing I'd say as well, which I think is very important, some people are not finishers, So I mean, closing out a project, there's a lot of checks and balances. There's a lot of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and some people are not necessarily tuned into that. And quite interestingly as well, I mentioned how, a lot of expertise, there's a bit of a brain drain off a project towards the end. And interestingly, when I was doing my research, my thesis, what I found in the common kind of thread in the literature, that less than 60% have actually closed out projects. So less than 60% of project managers have closed out a project. So what that means is there's a small cohort of people that are closing out projects, so they're gaining kind of a niche in that space, which is great for them, but it can be problematic for a project as well. So having the right people on a project at the end to make sure it closes well is really important, because as I mentioned, if a project closes badly, a lot of the hard work that's being put in over several years is kind of lost. You kind of you've done a lot of good and you've ended it with bad, which is essentially a disaster, to be honest.
Okay, once again, some amazing ideas, Carl, there. I'm just going to pick back up on, as you were talking about your 6 drivers of project fatigue, I thought about, we have tens of thousands of project managers all around the world who've been educated on that there are 10 knowledge areas of project management from the PMI's project management body of knowledge. And I almost see that the project fatigue could be an appendix to that, in terms of how you, I suppose, maintain your own health, your well-being, and also the well-being of the project in the bigger picture. The other thing that struck me as you were speaking is you talked about the burnout. And I remember when I read your article, which it really just came back to me as you were speaking, was the idea that in a large multi-year complex project, you should have an overarching steering committee on the project who are there maybe for the 3 years. But you then use the idea of different project teams coming and going, almost like the baton holder in a relay race, that somebody comes in, they do an amazing 6 months and they deliver a stage of the project, then they sort of step back out and we bring new people in. And I thought that was a very real way on how you do maintain commitment and passion and energy over a multi-year project. The idea of having an overarching steering committee that doesn't leave the project, but then having project teams that can step in and out. A little bit like building a house, perhaps. The foundations, the ground workers come, the block layers come, the roofers come, the electrician comes, the plumber comes, and the idea they each come in and add a huge amount of value, but they step back out and somebody comes in with a new level of passion.
Yeah, no, it's very true, John. And like when I look back on that big project that we were on, as I mentioned, I started on it in 2012. I moved on from that project in 2015, and it went on for another couple of years. And really, in terms of that steering committee that you mentioned, I would have been the first person. Then I mentioned that I handed the baton over to one of my colleagues at the time, and thankfully he's back working with Arcadis DPS the last couple of years, Ian. I handed the baton to Ian. So really, in terms of that 5 to 6 year period, it was myself, and then it was Ian, and then below us in terms of the project team itself, or project teams as it evolved. There was natural attrition in there, but certainly, I mean, let's be honest, in an ideal setting, you want zero attrition, certainly when you're talking about the right people. I mean, a bit of attrition can be a good thing if there's somebody that might be a good fit for a team. And we all have conducted and attended many interviews over the year. You're gauging somebody based on 30 minutes or an hour, but obviously then when people start working with you, if your gut instinct is right and you've made a good call, people end up being great contributors to the team. And every now and again you get it wrong. I've certainly got it wrong in the past, and probably will in the future, but hopefully not too often. But ultimately, having the right people on the team as long as you can is definitely the best way to go. And having that overriding steering kind of group, be it, at least 2 people, because if it's one, you have a single point of failure. And I mentioned there a while back, Sarah, that works with me now. Like, we're very lucky. We've a fantastic team, and we've a high performing team. I think we never settle for the status quo. So we're always challenging ourselves to be the best that we can be. But God forbid if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, and I definitely endeavor not to. If I do, Sarah is there coming behind me. And if something less dramatic happens, which I would like, that in a couple of years' time, maybe I go on and do something different in Arcadis DPS, that Sarah is coming up through the ranks to help there. So again, from a steering committee perspective, it's me, Sarah, and then a fantastic team below us.
Okay, what's really interesting listening to that is, if you've ever read any literature around the area of leadership, not just project leadership, leaders build other leaders, they develop other leaders. So it's very interesting to hear you talking about, and you've referred to this several times, that you're looking at developing your replacement even though you're doing the job. So it's in a really healthy, you're not going to be king or queen of the jungle forever, Carl. So that's good to hear. So I want to talk to you about your leadership style. That's a very honest sort of, I really like that the idea that you accept that your time will come and there will be somebody in the organization who may report to you now, and their time will come to do the job you're doing better than you're doing it now. And that might be that you step somewhere sideways or you step further up in the organization. But talk to me about project leadership. What's your style? Fundamentally, what's your approach to leadership?
Yeah, and again, this is something that I really think about a lot, and I've kind of carried in my head and probably my heart, I guess, over the years. And when I think of my leadership style, and I think it has evolved over the years, I think first and foremost, I'd regard myself as an authentic leader. And I think that feeds back or is fed by the fact that I'm a passionate person. And, I can be direct, but I obviously am diplomatic as well. So authentic would definitely be number one. I am participative as well. So I'm very much about the team dynamic, and, collaborating and working together is definitely, to me, the best way to go. So I'm very participative in what we do, and I would constantly kind of strive for as much collaboration as is feasibly possible. I mean, you don't want paralysis by analysis in every decision you're making, but I mean, there's a time and a place for collaboration, and certainly within my operation, we myself and the 4 leaders in the group, we meet, twice a week, and we discuss a lot of the tactical stuff and a lot of the strategic stuff. That's collaboration. And then, there's also a lot of event storming and collaboration sessions, etc., across the team. So that's one, authentic, participative. And I think the third one, directive. So every now and again, in my role, I do need to make a call. So I consider the challenge that's in front of us. I consider the perspectives of the appropriate people in the team. And sometimes, not too often, I I like as much as possible to not have to be directive, but it definitely comes up a few times a year that I have to make a judgment call, and I'm comfortable doing that. And then ultimately, I think the aspiration for any good leader is transformational. So I would like to think on occasions I'm transformational. So for example, I attend all our final interviews, and I think, you know, my passion can be beneficial there in terms of talking about the journey we're on in terms of the work we're doing. And it is very much a journey. While we are delivering to our client across multiple sites around the world, it's a journey. It's a very exciting journey. We work hard and we have a lot of fun. So, you know, sharing that message and kind of helping people see the vision and buy into what we're part of, I think is very important. Because one thing I've noticed over the years, now that I'm part of a software team, you know, I mentioned earlier that I was essentially on the front line for the first kind of 4 years of my career with DPS. Whereas now in software, like a lot of the team are cutting code, you know, bug fixing, doing all that and very important stuff, but they're not necessarily client facing. So it's very easy for people that don't see what this is all about, see the big picture. It's very, very easy for those folks to, you know, to not really buy into what they're part of. And I mean, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, we're but one team and indeed one company that are supporting this kind of, you know, multinational huge client. But all of us across Arcadis DPS and many other companies are contributing to, you know, multi-billion-dollar projects that are changing the way the world lives, you know, so in terms of the tech that's coming out. So at every opportunity, if you can be somewhat transformational in terms of sharing the message, I think it's very, very important.
Okay, and I think that comes back to your earlier point about recharging the batteries. In order to bring that level of transformational change into a project, into an organization, I do definitely think you have to step back, recharge the batteries, and sort of go back into the battlefield again to try and do that. One final question as I listen to you, Carl. I think it must be very difficult to assess these large, you know, complex technology, multi-billion, multi-year projects purely on the triple constraint or the iron triangle of time, cost, scope. And it's something I think there's an extensive body of literature on in terms of how we assess project success or how we assess project failure. And it's something that project managers will always agree to disagree on. But in terms of your experience, in terms of your career to date, and in terms of the large, complex projects you're working on, just talk to me a little bit about your gut feeling about project success or failure, please.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, when I was doing the literature review for my MBA thesis, I obviously did a lot of research on project success, project failure, and, you know, PMI and LCI, there's a lot of kind of excellent project management bodies around the world that, you know, where you can read up on this stuff. And then you have the more traditional academic journals as well. And, you know, what I felt and realized very early on, you know, in my research, there's actually an obsession with project success and indeed project failure, you know, based on the traditional metrics that you mentioned there a few moments ago, John. And all of that stuff is valid. But as I said earlier, at the end of the day, and essentially till the end of time, it's going to be humans that are delivering projects. And when you look at these big companies like Arcadis, DPS, and you know, big companies like that are delivering, you know, successive projects. So they're working on projects kind of simultaneously, and then there's that kind of, you know, handshake or kind of baton passing from one project to the next. And, you know, Arcadis DPS, we're very fortunate that we've a lot of high caliber people, and we've a lot of people that are with the company for a bunch of years. So ultimately, you know, for all of us that are kind of have been long term in the company, managing our energy levels and kind of managing, being aware of that project fatigue element is critically important. Because I know for personally, you know, I took that 5 weeks off in May 2015, and you know, I didn't make a big song and dance out of it. You know, it timing wise, it was actually fairly easy to do. And my boss, Richie, at the time was fantastic in that he facilitated it. But I have no doubt whatsoever, looking back, that if I hadn't have taken that time, whatever I bring to these projects, I would have brought a lesser version of me to the next project. So even though I would have had all the expertise and, you know, the client on the next project would have expected a certain standard from me, I know in my heart of hearts, I wouldn't have been capable of delivering as well as I had on the project that I just finished out on. So, managing fatigue, as I say, we're all human, and we can, all the metrics in the world are there, but those soft indicators around how the actual people on the project are, coping with what they're doing and in it for the long haul. Because I do often think, like, it's a marathon, not a sprint on these big projects. And, if I put it in more human terms, we've all kind of suffered loss in our lives. And, for example, myself and my family lost our mother a few years ago, quite tragically. And, there was a bedside vigil with my mom for, a couple of weeks. And you can do that. So you can kind of do the 24/7 by a bed when somebody is gravely ill. But if somebody is ill for 6 months or a year or 2 years, you can't do that, because normal life has to continue and you have to maintain your energy levels. And I think really then you're looking at, again, when you're thinking of a sick patient, you're looking at some sort of rota where, family who are a team ultimately in circumstances like that, or certainly should be, have to put structure in place so that they can take certain nights of the week to do stuff. And it's the exact same on these big projects, that a short burst project that's a couple of weeks, you can sell your soul to it. You can work night and day and you'll get through it. But when you're working on projects that are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, that approach just won't work. I mean, you'll be grand for maybe a year or 2 years, and at some point you're going to hit a brick wall, and coming back from that can be very difficult. So ultimately, managing the fatigue that your teams are feeling, I think, is critically important. And for companies like Arcadis, DPS, and many like it, kind of having a framework like I put together, and I'm not professing to say it's the best framework in the world, but ultimately, if we're thinking about kind of looking after the people on these projects, and I don't mean a Christmas night out or a bonus at the end of the year, all of that stuff is nice, but ultimately how you support your people and your teams is on a daily, weekly basis. And if you can build an ethos in where you care about each other, support each other, ultimately you're going to have higher performing teams for a longer period of time. And that to me is the win, and there's no losers in that.
Okay, that's very interesting. So listening to your final comment or answer, in terms of supporting people, I really thought that most organizations are very good at talking the talk, but it's walking the talk in terms of supporting people in high pressure project roles. One thing that I have to say is you've certainly walked the talk today. And by doing so, I simply mean you've been very vulnerable in your answers. You've been honest, you've been vulnerable, you've talked about your mistakes. And it's very clear, while you're a very experienced project leader, you're still on a journey of continuous improvement. And that to me is my takeaway from our discussion. So Carl Burney, I'd like to thank you for joining me on the Project Management Paradise podcast. And I wish you well in the next stage in your career. And I'm sure I'll meet you again sometime in person. Thank you very much, Carl.
Thanks a lot, John. It's been my pleasure. And, engaging with you on forums like this is always very, very interesting. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast at projectmanagementparadise.com.